So this is the first session of a training course for regional farmers organizations in Africa on climate negotiations, Unfccc, so United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention. This is organized in collaboration with the Pan-African Farmers Organization, World Farmers Organization, Andreas Hermes Akademie, Deutscher Bauernverband, and FFD. I will facilitate you through this session that should take about 2 hours. Since this is the first session, we hope that the time is sufficient. I'm trying to go down. Okay, so today's session consists of these parts. We'll first have opening remarks by AHA, Anders Hermes Akademie. Then we have the welcoming words by the CEO from Pan-African Farmers Organization. I will go through the introduction to the whole course that will take place online during the next, say, 6-7 months. Then I will discuss something on the key concepts that are used. We'll have a presentation by Dr. James Murombedzi. We have a questions and answers. After that, we have also 10 minutes to go through kind of a survey on how did you feel that this session went, and hopefully agree on the date for the next session. But I would stop sharing now and give the floor to AHA, who has promised to give the opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. Good morning to everybody also from my side, from sunny Berlin. My name is Clara Lange. I'm a program manager at Andreas Hermes Akademie, in short, AHA, and I'm trusted with the program management of this seminar series from AHA side. The AHA is an education provider, and we are already involved with, I think, most of your farmers' organizations. And last year, some of my colleagues were working with some African farmers' representatives at the Bonn Climate Change Conference. And these representatives, they repeatedly noted that they have a need for more background knowledge of the climate negotiations before participating in these events, so they can advocate adequately for their members' interests. And that's how this sparked the idea of an online course in preparation for the next upcoming climate change negotiations. And yeah, the AHA got together with PAFO, WFO, and FFD to develop this seminar series. And yeah, we are very happy and proud that we are able to launch this series today with these wonderful partners. And also I'm very excited to hear more about you, our participants. So please feel free to use the seminar series not only as a knowledge input, but also as an opportunity to network and to form an alliance so you can send a consistent message at COP28. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you and wish us all a fruitful first session today. Thank you. And then I'll give the word to my colleague, Christoph.
Thank you very much, Clara, and good morning to all of you from my side as well. My name is Christoph Bracher. I'm backstopping this project here at the Andreas Hermes Academy. The Andreas Hermes Academy is funding this seminar series on the UNFCCC processes and the role of farmer organizations can play in it. I'm very pleased that this is taking place and starting today. For this, I would also thank again PAFO for the auspice and as organizer, WFO for their great support, FFD for designing and conducting most of the sessions, and of course, all of you for your active participation. I would like to quickly underline what my colleague Clara already mentioned. The idea of this seminar series came from the expressed need of farmer representatives to better understand the processes in the conferences, the subsidiary bodies, and the national plans in the UNFCCC. and to know where the entry points for farmer organizations are. And I'm convinced this seminar series will provide clarity in this regard. Related to this, we also have the expectation that the opportunities to influence the farmer's cause in these processes will be strengthened through this seminar series. And to support this, there will also be sessions to address the potential roles of farmer organizations, and also a capacity building session on advocacy. So we hope that from your participation in that seminar, the farmer's cause can be effectively represented in the climate negotiations from a national to a global level. Yeah, and with this, I now wish you an interesting and instructive seminar, and I look forward to your contributions to the discussion with your experiences and your views. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Christopher. Thanks, Clara. And now I would like to invite Babafemi Oyewole to say the opening words on behalf of PAFO. Please, Babafemi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina, for giving me the opportunity to address this first session of the capacity building program. As mentioned by Clara and Christophe, and also you have given us the agenda of the program. I just want to highlight that the capacity building has been planned to help participants at UNFCCC and COP meetings to navigate the complexities of the events and take opportunity that they offer farmers organizations and their members to benefit maximally from their participation. This is because we know that climate change is having some adverse effects on agriculture in Africa, and this calls for urgent action on the part of stakeholders so that we'll be able to understand the issues involved and also contribute effectively to finding solutions. And again, we know that the agricultural sector is a very significant sector in Africa, and there is need to give better voice to the regional farmers organizations so that they can defend the interests of their members. And also, we see that the challenge of food security makes it imperative for us to know how we can mitigate and adapt to climate change so that we'll be able to have a sustainable food systems in Africa. Again, we see that there is limited access, financial access or access to finance by the farmers and the farmers organizations. So we know that this seminar will help the participants to understand the issue so that every opportunity that we have to raise the voice of farmers and the farmers organizations will be utilized to advocate for more finance to the sector. So PAFO is happy to collaborate with the various partners that has been mentioned in the development of this capacity building program. And I wish that all the participants will be committed to it. So it's online, but we need the commitment of all the participants so that we'll be able to have maximum benefit from the capacity building. So I would like to thank all our partners that are collaborating with us to launch this training program. And I hope that we are going to benefit from it and also transfer the knowledge that we have to other members who are not able to participate in the program. I wish you a fruitful deliberations and hope to hear good feedback from all the participants. Thank you.
Dear Papa Femi, thank you for the words.
Yes.
I was requested by AHA to go through very quickly the, introduction of the people who are on board. So maybe I could ask you one by one to open your camera and microphone and tell who you are. I would like to start with the, let's see, I have here Tinashe Handuka from Sakau.
Thanks, Tina. My name is Tinashe Chavunduka. I work for the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions as a program coordinator responsible for climate resilience in Southern Africa. I think all the participants would know who Sakau is. We are the regional farmers organization from Southern Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about misspelling your name or violating.
No problem at all. I would do the same to yours, so no worries.
Okay, next one I would like to ask Celestin Nga, please.
Merci beaucoup, Tina. Bonjour.
Thank you very much, Tina. Good morning, everyone. I am talking from Yaoundé, Cameroon. I am Ga Celesta. I am working for the regional platform of farmers for Central Africa PROPAC, and I am the head of the Department of Research and Innovation. Thank you very much.
Merci, Celestin. We already saw Christophe and Clara. Then I would like to ask Derek Capolo to present himself or introduce.
Good morning, everyone.
I'm sorry, Derek. It seems that your connection is breaking.
I am from Malawi, working for farmers in Malawi as the head of agribusiness. I also coordinate climate action for farmers in Malawi. Hello.
Thanks, Derek. We heard the last part that you're working with climate very nicely, but I think that it might be good if you write your information to a chat, because in the beginning, the line was breaking a lot. I see here next one, Evans. It's still breaking a bit. If you don't mind, Derek, I would like to ask you to write your information to the chat box, just to make sure that we all understood. I think you are from Malawi. In any case, I'd like to continue the introduction round. I have next.
I will just type.
Lorraine Avour.
Hi everyone, my name is Lorena Kinyawur and I work with the Kenya National Farmers Federation. Thank you.
Thanks. Then I have Emerance here.
Thank you, Tina. Good morning, everybody. Once again, my name is Emerance Tuishime. I'm the Programs Officer of PAFO, the Pan-African Farmers Organization. We are based in Kigali, Rwanda, and I'm excited to be here with all of you for this program. And we look forward to learn more on how we can support our members as farmers organization to push their voice for COP28. Thank you.
Thanks, Emerance. Then I'd like to invite Martin Duplessis. Martin, are you there? We can't hear you. Okay, Martin will write his information. There seems to be a problem with the microphone. Then we have PAFO communication.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Insaf Bourdiri, and I'm the PAFO Communication Officer. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Insaf.
Thank you, Tina.
Then we have Philippe Conzeros.
Hello, good morning. I'm Philipp Conzeros from Andreas Hermes Academy in Germany, Deputy Director of the International Branch of AHA. Thank you for coming together, and I'm very interested to listening and learning more. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Then I'd like to invite Samuel Sentumwe.
Hello, I can't hear anything. Hello?
We can hear you. Samuel, now you're muted. Okay, Samuel also wrote his information to the chat box. And then we have Sakina Mukavele.
Good morning again. Good morning. My name is, as I say, I'm Sakina Mukavele from Mozambique. I'm a farmer, but also I'm coordinating Mozambican farmers movement, and also working with the area of environment. And I'm a member of W4. Thank you.
Thanks, Sakina. And then we have Tutkul.
Bonjour.
So good morning, everyone. I am Tutkul Drem. I am the regional coordinator of PROPAC. PROPAC is the regional platform of farmers of Central Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then we have our presenter, Dr. James Murombedzi.
Thank you, Tina. Good morning, everyone. My name is James Murombedzi. I'm the coordinator of African Climate Policy Center. I'm the coordinator of the African Climate Policy Center at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to making the presentation and discussing the UNFCCC process with everyone. Thanks again.
Okay. Wait a sec. All right. I didn't go through those ones who had already spoken, nor the interpreters. We appreciate a lot the interpreters, but we'll focus now on the participants. And now I will continue my presentation. Just a sec. Okay, so now we'll continue with the introduction to the training course. So first of all, objective of the whole training course is really to strengthen African regional and national farmers organizations to understand, to participate, and to influence the climate negotiations. So the process related to UNFCCC, and specifically to understand key concepts which are used in this process, and especially those focusing on agriculture, food security, and rural development. Go through the key processes of climate negotiations, the actors involved, and what are the different bodies related to the UNFCCC. Also, how national processes towards preparing, negotiating, and reporting to the Framework Convention are conducted. And we cover some part of the finance as well. There will be different sessions. So the session 1 that we have just started is really to go through the basic concepts and the history of the Climate Change Convention. The next one will be conducted under the responsibility of World Farmers Organization, which is focusing more on farmer constituency and the role of farmers organization. Next one will be conducted by AHA, which is on lobby and advocacy. There will be the fourth one, which is more on subsidiary bodies. There's one on science and technology and another one on implementation. This is linked to the so-called SP 58 meeting that will take place in June. We'll see a bit if we adjust slightly the session 2, 3, and 4 so that they could be held before the SP 58 meeting that will take place in Bonn in June. Then we discuss AFOLO sector. I go through what AFOLO means in a couple of minutes. And the Sharm el Sheikh joint work in agriculture that was agreed last year in Egypt. Next session would be on national processes and reporting to the Framework Convention. We would then proceed to loss and damage, adaptation market mechanism, carbon sequestration. That's held by FFD, funds and climate funding, how the different mechanisms work, what kind of infra requirements they are, etc. The next session, which will be held before the next Conference of Parties meeting that will take place in United Arab Emirates. And then finally, WFO will introduce a session on negotiation skills and how to prepare agriculture-oriented arguments. I didn't put the dates on these because this is something we have to agree together. We also conducted this kind of a starting survey. It was not to measure your competence, but really to understand a bit your level. We had 11 respondents and 64% of them had already participated in the COP meetings. 5 of these respondents participated in national decision-making or advisory body. The majority wanted really to improve access to climate funding for farm organizations. About the half wanted to learn how to influence the negotiations. About 1/3 really wanted to learn more about accreditation to bring climate fund or decision-making as regards agriculture and learn on adaptation, loss and damage, and disaster risk reduction. And a little bit than 1/4 of the respondents wanted to learn more about national processes on climate decision-making and planning. As a conclusion, we could see that there are some participants who have a good knowledge on the processes, and then there are those ones who feel rather insecure on what kind of a terminology is used, what do they mean, etc. So we try to be flexible and respond to your different needs. The sessions will be conducted so that there will be always this kind of expert presentation. Like this time we have Dr. Murombedzi. We have been trying to explore different African experts on climate change so that, you know, they would come from the continent. There will always be interpretation between English and French. And at the end, we'll have a session of questions and answers that allow you to ask more specifications and indicate maybe your feedback. We hope to introduce more interactive responses as well. This time we are going to use Mentimeter. I'll give you at the end of the session the right code and the session number. They usually take 1 hour, 45 minutes, but this session will take a little bit longer because we had the introduction. And as I mentioned, there is the feedback possibility at the end. I would like to continue now directly on some key concepts and terms, a little bit on finance. So in the climate change context, usually when you talk about agriculture, you talk about so-called PAFO sector. And this comes from the words agriculture, forestry, and other land use. It started actually in the beginning of this process when the parties were discussing about greenhouse gases. And IPCC that was going through the academic research on this, they first talked about land use change and forestry, because that was really the focus in the beginning of the negotiations. Then agriculture was linked together with these other land use sectors and forestry. So first it was LULUCF, and then it became AFOLU. And now AFOLU is really, you know, how to deal with land-based activities, agriculture, forestry, and other activities. When you deal with land use and forestry, so LULUCF, you talk a lot about carbon dioxide, CO2, emissions and removals. This is because forests, they capture a lot of CO2, so they are important for the mitigation of climate change. When you talk about AFOLU, where you have agriculture on board as well, then you have 2 other greenhouse gases on board. And this is the methane and nitrous oxide, because agricultural practices often emit these 2 gases. So it's when you deal with the forest, it's a lot about the CO2 and how it's removed. With agriculture, it's more about, or including also methane and nitrous oxide. These gases are more emitted, but agriculture through soil and vegetation can also remove these gases from the atmosphere. This picture shows you like how the different processes work in agriculture. So the forest, as I said, it will capture carbon dioxide, but then on the other hand, when it's harvested or burned, then it releases the different gases. Ruminants, and especially cows, are very much emitting methane. From manure, you get methane, but also nitrous oxide. Soil, on the other hand, captures the gases. And then you have rice production that emits a lot of methane. So you see agriculture and this so-called AFOLU sector, it goes 2 ways. It produces greenhouse gases, but it also removes them from the atmosphere. And I think this is the strength of the AFOLU sector. When you deal with other sectors, they're usually just calculating the emissions. With agriculture, you can also talk about removals. Now there seems that somebody's microphone is open. I hope that you can switch all the microphones off. There's somebody's microphone open. Okay, so and let's take the last slide. So what are the principal sources? So which are the activities that release greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide? And when we look at these, we notice that it's really about animal husbandry, and especially when you deal with cattle that release the largest amount of greenhouse gases. You talk more than half. And one part comes really from rumination, from enteric fermentation that produces a lot of methane. And then we have manure, which is left on the pasture that releases carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. Fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers is another important source. And paddy rice production is one of the big emitters in this sector. And this is because when the soil is covered by water, it produces methane. You notice here that manure management also, in addition to manure left on pasture, is emitting the greenhouse gases. And then we have a burning of savannas. In addition to this, when you're dealing with forests, there's also emissions calculated when you deforest, for example, for agriculture or building, and that is also calculated like emissions, because then you remove the trees that otherwise would capture the greenhouse gases. This was a very short session on the key concepts and terms. Finally, I didn't go to the finance, even if I promised. But then I think that I would now give the floor to Dr. James Murombedzi. I noticed, James, that your connection was not perfect. So maybe you could keep your camera off, you just speak, and I would share the screen, if that's all right.
So I already started the sharing, Tina.
Okay.
Can you tell me if you can see my screen?
This is fine. Let's try like this.
Okay. If for any reason it doesn't work, then we can always go back to you sharing. So as Tina says, I'm going to be talking about the UNFCCC process, and essentially just presenting the origins of the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change, as well as some of the main processes under that convention from the beginning up to the present moment. And perhaps we can have a little more detailed discussion about the implications or contextualize the UNFCCC within the agriculture sector. The way we are going to do this is we'll talk about the origins and the trajectory of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then we'll talk about the Conference of Parties process and some of the main events that have happened under the UNFCCC process, including the main treaties of the convention, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. We'll also talk about specific moments in the trajectory of the convention, which have defined the climate response in significant ways. And then we'll very quickly go through some of the main outcomes of specific conferences of parties and also seek to understand contemporary issues in the lead up to COP28, which is the next conference of parties. So going to the origins and the progression of the UNFCCC. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I think there's someone also with an open mic there. So the UNFCCC can actually be traced back to the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which was established in 1988 and it was established as a result of the recognition within the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Program that in fact the global climate system was actually changing. And this was based on observations that were being undertaken, particularly at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, but also observations that were taking place in many climate and weather observation stations across the globe, that there was irrefutable evidence that the climate system was changing, firstly, and that the changes were actually due to human interference with that climate system, that climate change was in fact anthropogenic. However, in order to establish a scientific case for anthropogenic interference with the climate system, the WMO, World Met Organization, and UNEP established a panel to undertake scientific assessments of what exactly was happening with the climate system and what was causing those changes in the climate system. As a scientific body, the IPCC itself, in fact, was not established to carry out any basic or applied research, but rather it was established as an intergovernmental panel which would review existing climate weather assessments and publications, published research. As a result of those assessments, they would make specific recommendations regarding, firstly, what was causing climate change, and secondly, how it could be addressed. And so the IPCC started working back in 1988 and reduced their first assessment report in 1990. And in that first assessment report, the IPCC effectively concluded that emissions resulting from human activities are substantially increasing the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. In other words, in its very first assessment, the IPCC concluded that climate change was occurring, and it was occurring as a result of human activity.
Dear James,
Yes.
It seems that the interpreters have difficulties. The connection is not very clear. I wonder if I could share, and then you speak and you keep your camera off, so we try to reduce the weight. Is that all right?
Okay, sure, that's fine then. So let me stop sharing.
If you stop sharing, I can share your presentation.
Yeah, okay, I'm trying to stop it now. Right, I think I've stopped. Yeah, so I was on the third slide. Yeah, that one. So maybe if you could put it in a slideshow mode.
Is it now okay?
My microphone, my headset. Is this better?
Yes, this is better.
Okay. So I think I was at the point where I was saying that in their first assessment report, the IPCC established a strong scientific case that climate change is anthropogenic. And at that second World Conference on Climate Change, they called for a global treaty on climate change, a global treaty which would respond to the recommendations that were being made by the IPCC. So the UN General Assembly then established an intergovernmental negotiations committee on the basis of the recommendations of the IPCC. And the committee effectively held several sessions where they discussed how a global treaty for climate change could be constructed and what it would mean. And so they discussed, for instance, the need to have targets and binding commitments for emissions reductions, as well as timetables for those emissions reductions. They discussed financial mechanisms for financing the climate response, as well as the need for technology transfer from developed to developing countries to ensure transitions from emitting technologies to green technologies. But they also discussed a very important principle, which is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities of developed and developing countries. This principle was based on the recognition that climate changes, or rather anthropogenic interference with the climate system, it started or it accelerated with the Industrial Revolution, and that greenhouse gas emissions were largely driven by the use of fossil fuels, which were the main the main energy source of the Industrial Revolution: coal, hydrocarbons, and then subsequently all of the other processes that were put in motion by the rapid industrialization. And so this meant that there is a linear relationship between the level of industrialization and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, both current and historical. And so those countries that developed early, benefited from the Industrial Revolution, are also more responsible for greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere than those countries which are either currently industrializing or which have not embarked on transforming their productive processes. So those were the origins. Next slide, please, Tina. Now, in 1992, the United Nations, all of the United Nations members adopted the text that was proposed for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was at the General Assembly, and very rapidly, in June of 1992, the UN opened the text, or the UNFCCC, for signature by the members of the United Nations. And that signature would be at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as the World Earth Summit, which was convened in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992. So the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro did in fact accept the UNFCCC text and began the process of signing the convention. Now, the reason why it's referred to as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and not, for instance, the UN Convention as the other conventions are, is precisely because the 1992 treaty did not specify any specific commitments and any specific targets and agreements from parties, because there was no agreement between the parties about what each individual party would contribute to climate action. And so the treaty was eventually designed in a way that would frame future discussions on what could constitute climate action and how it would be constituted. At the same Earth Summit in '92, there were also two other conventions that were agreed. The first was the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which deals with all issues related to biodiversity and ecosystems and seeks to limit biodiversity, ecosystems, and genetic losses as a result of human activity. And then there was also the Convention to Combat Desertification, which, as the name implies, focuses specifically on limiting desertification and ensuring that ecosystems continue to function. Next slide, please. So the UN process is such that once a treaty or a convention is put forward to members in the United Nations General Assembly, members then have to sign up to that treaty, and a certain minimum number of members need to be signed up before it becomes binding. And secondly, when a member signs up to a treaty, they still have to go through national processes of ratifying that treaty, usually through parliamentary processes, depending on the governance system in force. And once you reach a certain number of ratifications among the parties, and then that treaty becomes enters into force. As I said, the UNFCCC is a framework convention in the sense that it did not, in fact, contain any binding commitments. It is a voluntary convention, but subsequent treaties do, in fact, come up with a binding commitments on different aspects of our climate actions. So in March 1994, the UNFCCC had acquired the sufficient numbers of ratifications to enter into force. So it becomes the treaty, the convention which governs the responses, global responses to climate change. Now, all of the countries that sign up to the treaty then become the parties to the convention. They are the convention, and each party is actually a government party. And significantly, what this means is all other participants in the convention who are not formal parties, who are not governments, in fact, do not have any decision-making capacity within the operation of the convention. So this means organizations like farmers' organizations, representatives of the private sector, academia, the youth, and so on, although they can participate in the operation of the framework convention, they do not take any decisions independently. However, we should note that increasingly there is a focus on how we can, or how the convention can engage what are called non-state actors more effectively in the operation of the convention. So members of the treaty, the parties, but also others who are not parties, the parties are state actors, and non-state actors are not parties to the convention. Now, the signatories to the UNFCCC, almost every country in the world, in fact, has signed up to the UNFCCC. Although, as we know, we have had parties withdrawing from the convention or from some of the treaties of the convention for various reasons, and we can discuss the impact of that on the operation of the convention. So the parties meet annually at the conference of the parties, the COP, and the purpose of the COP is to negotiate the multilateral responses to climate change. The Conference of Parties itself is the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC. So decisions that are taken by the parties and the way in which this operates is that all decisions are consensual, which means you actually have to have every party agreeing to a decision that is taken at COP for it to be effective. And this has remained one of the sort of the big challenges of the operation of the UNFCCC, where in many instances you actually do not have consensual agreements, and therefore implementation of activities becomes challenging. The parties meet every year to review progress on the implementation of the convention, but also to put in place mechanisms for making the implementation of the convention more effective based on the results, the outcomes of the reviews. And the decisions that are taken at the COP are taken by government representatives participating. As I say, all other parties that are participating in that COP, in fact, are not decision-making participants. Next slide, please. The convention itself is served by a secretariat. The secretariat is the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, UNCC. And the mandate of the secretariat is actually laid out within the convention. Article 8 of the UNFCCC describes what the secretariat does, how it does it, and how it is funded, and so on. And its main functions include making logistical arrangements for sessions of the convention, as well as various protocol bodies of the convention. We'll discuss those a little bit later. The Secretariat also assists the convention to monitor implementation of commitments that are made by the parties under the different agreements and decisions of the conferences of parties. They also assist in the implementation of commitments. They maintain registries of parties' emissions, as well as they maintain details of progress under emissions trading schemes. And we'll discuss emissions and trading later on as well. They also coordinate with the secretariats of other relevant international bodies and conventions, such as the two conventions of the two other Rio conventions, but also other treaties such as the World Trade Organization, treaties around peace and security, and other treaties that have an implication or are affected by climate change. The Secretariat itself is located in Germany, in Bonn, and it is significant to note that meetings of some of the technical bodies of the UNFCCC are also organized by the Secretariat in Bonn twice every year. We'll get to that. Next slide, please. So the bodies, in addition to the Secretariat, the UNFCCC also established two subsidiary bodies, which meet twice a year. They have a mid-sessional meeting every June, and then they have a second meeting in conjunction with the Conference of Parties, and it is held wherever the Conference of Parties is being held. The first is the subsidiary body for implementation, the SBI, and its main function is to provide advice to the Conference of Parties on the implementation of the convention. The SBI evaluates and reviews the effective implementation of the UNFCCC, and the key building blocks for the evaluation for that assessment. Firstly, they focus on transparency within the implementation of climate actions by the parties. They focus on progress regarding mitigation actions. Mitigation focuses on emissions reduction as well as green transitions. They also monitor and provide advice to the COP on progress regarding adaptation to climate change, on finance as well as on capacity building. As you know, transparency, mitigation, adaptation, finance, and capacity building are the fundamental building blocks of the UNFCCC. The SBI provides these evaluations through a process called the MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So they monitor the activities of the parties as reported by the parties themselves. They review the reports and they verify what is contained in those reports. And they do this through a process that is called an International Assessment and Review Process, IAR, which aims to, the main aim of the international review process is actually to promote compatibility between the efforts of the different parties in all of the key building blocks of the UNFCCC. In other words, to ensure that parties make commitments, implementing those commitments, but that there's compatibility between the activities of all of the different parties. So that is the first subsidiary body. The second subsidiary body of the UNFCCC is the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, the SABSTA. And SABSTA, as the name implies, provides the COP with advice on scientific, technological, and methodological matters relating to climate change and its effect. Again, it's established under Article 9 of the UNFCCC. It also provides advice to the implementation of the two main treaties under the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. We'll discuss those in a moment. But unlike the SABSTA, which is focusing on mitigation, on adaptation, and so on, unlike the SBI, SABSTA focuses particularly on climate impacts, on vulnerability to climate change, and on the effects of climate response measures, including adaptations to climate change. And it also seeks to promote technology transfer, but provides guidelines for reviewing greenhouse gas inventories and so on. Now, because it is focusing on assessing issues around impacts, issues around vulnerabilities and so on, the work of the scientific SABSTA is actually also carried out in conjunction with the assessments of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC issues participants assessments once every 4 years of the performance and progress in climate change. And the SABSTA digs into the assessments of the IPCC reports and uses those to assess the progress in the implementation of the convention, and also to make recommendations about further studies, further research that is required to understand climate change. Next slide, please. Now, coming back to the structure of the convention itself, the main objective of the convention is to actually combat dangerous human interference with the climate system. Dangerous defined as irreversible human interference with the climate system. We can discuss the details here, but for instance, the structure of the Paris Agreement is based on the recognition that if global warming exceeds 2 degrees, there is every possibility that it becomes irreversible, that certain feedback mechanisms begin to kick in, and that whatever, regardless of whatever we do, we can no longer stop the changes that are occurring in the climate system. And therefore, the Paris Agreement aims to limit global warming to 2 degrees, which is where, if you go beyond that, then you will lose control over what happens. So the whole purpose of the convention is to actually ensure that we don't get to the point where there is irreversible human interference with the climate system. And it seeks to do this by stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere through processes of managing emissions, mitigation, but also managing the absorption of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere through various ecological and as well as engineering processes. The UNFCCC actually called for classified parties into annex and non-annex. This is in line with the principle of common but differentiated and historical responsibilities. So annex parties are those parties that are basically advanced economies, as well as economies in transition. Or this is to say, annex parties are those parties which are deemed to have contributed significantly to greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, while non-annex parties or non-annex 1 parties are primarily developing countries whose main responsibility whose main concern in climate action is to adapt to the impacts of climate change and recognizing that they are not responsible for much of that climate change. So that is the structure of the UNFCCC. Next slide, please. So the agreement, the UNFCCC, as we saw, was came into force in 1994. The parties to the agreement had their first meeting in 1995, almost exactly a year after the convention came into force. And that first meeting, COP1, was held in Berlin, in Germany, and it was presided over by Angela Merkel, who, as we know, later on became the Chancellor of Germany. Now, there were very significant decisions made there. And those were based on the recommendations of the scientific, the subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice, SABSTA, which recommended that the commitments that parties had made, the voluntary commitments that parties had made to the convention at its adoption were in fact inadequate for meeting the objectives of limiting climate change in order to avoid irreversible interference with the climate system. So when parties signed up, they basically did not make commitments that would have achieved that objective. Now, because the convention did not contain any binding emissions, the member countries at COP1 decided that the commitments were firstly not sufficient, and that the best way towards ensuring that they were adequate commitments would be for the adoption of a protocol which would contain binding commitments. among Annex 1 parties to limit their greenhouse gas emissions. So the focus is only on Annex 1 parties, developed economies and economies in transition. But they also set up a new subsidiary body, which was an ad hoc group to negotiate the structure of that protocol, which would contain binding agreements. And so the Berlin mandate was put in place, which established a process for negotiating strengthened commitments for developed countries towards climate action. And this was the basis of the first treaty, the first binding treaty that was read under the UNFCCC, which is the Kyoto Protocol. Next slide, please. So, well, COP2 continued the negotiations towards the operationalization of the Berlin mandate, but it was not until COP3 in 1997 that the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. Significantly, the Kyoto Protocol was the world's first greenhouse gas emissions reduction treaty. Treaty in the sense that it was binding, different from the convention, which was not, or which did not contain binding commitments. The challenge, however, with the Kyoto Protocol is that it covers only 27% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is to say that the commitments, the emissions reductions that were agreed in the Kyoto Protocol are emissions reductions by developed countries and developed economies in transition, which meant that every other economy did not in fact have any commitment. Now, those countries that had commitments account for only 27% of contemporary greenhouse gas emissions in 1997. So that was a challenge. Now, again, going back to the Climate Change Secretariat, it also became the Secretariat of the protocol, and the subsidiary bodies also provide support to the protocol. So you have the SABSTA and the SBI contributing to monitoring performance and so on. But the Annex 1 countries agreed as part of their agreement of their Kyoto Protocol undertaking to ensure that their overall emissions of greenhouse gases would be reduced by at least 5% below 1990 levels in the commitment period between 2008 to 2012. So the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol was in fact 5 years. And 1990 was chosen as the baseline for understanding human interference, although climate change had actually been occurring for more than a century before then. Now, by the end of that year, 2008, the Annex 1 nations had reduced their overall emissions by only 1.2%. And most of the reductions actually came from the former Soviet bloc countries. And as we know, the reason was because those economies had effectively stopped functioning. And so there was no significant reduction as a result of the operation of the protocol itself or of the UNFCCC, but rather the convention was from causes unrelated to climate action. Again, this is a very significant observation. Next slide. So the operationalization of the Kyoto Protocol after its adoption in 1997 was finally agreed in COP6 in Bonn, where the rule book of the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. The rule book essentially refers to the manual, the procedures, and the processes for the implementation of the provisions of the protocol. And these are the provisions regarding how much each party would be reducing, how that would be reported, how that would be monitored, and the mechanisms for trading in carbon credits and so on. However, significantly, the biggest emitting economy, the USA, refused to ratify the protocol. Basically, you have And after the Bonn meeting of 2001, you also had other countries, Canada, Australia, Russia, withdrawing, although they initially ratified the protocol. They also withdrew from the protocol, again limiting the effectiveness of the UNFCCC. Next slide, please. Next slide. So that was a COP6. Now, the 7th Conference of Parties produced what are referred to as the Marrakesh Accords, which were basically defining the terms on which the Kyoto Protocol will be ratified by individual parties. The accords address the actual operationalization of the protocol, including 3 mechanisms: the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, the Joint Implementation Mechanism, JI, and the Emissions Trading Mechanism, the ET. Now, the whole purpose of these 3 mechanisms was to ensure that there was adequate accounting for emissions, but also that the limitations placed on emissions would not restrict the operation of the economies of those countries that were undertaking emissions reductions under the protocol and under the UNFCCC. And this was done through the operation of the Clean Development Mechanism, allowed for if parties, developed countries, Annex 1 parties, had committed to limiting their greenhouse gas emissions by X amount. If, however, in any particular year, those emissions were going to increase beyond X, those countries could actually invest in another country which was not exceeding its emissions reductions targets. And they could invest in projects that would support clean development. Projects such as, for instance, capturing carbon dioxide emissions from coal power plants, or investing in technologies, production technologies, which reduced emissions. That was the CDM. We also had the Joint Implementation Mechanism, JI. So the CDM operated between any countries, developed and developing, developed and developed, and so on. While the difference with the Joint Implementation Mechanism was that it focused on facilitating trade in emissions between Annex 1 parties. Emissions trading itself was actually based on the creation of registries to measure the amounts of emissions and to create a market in carbon credits. So a credit is where, for instance, a country, an institution, a corporation saves a carbon or invests in a process that does not produce emissions, or creates opportunities for the absorption of emissions from the atmosphere. And for every ton of carbon that is saved through those processes, that ton is credited. That ton becomes a credit. So a carbon credit is 1 ton or the equivalent of 1 ton of carbon dioxide that is either stored in a forest, in an ecosystem such as a wetland, or that is actually saved through, for instance, managing operation systems, improving production systems, and so on. So an institution, a body that has a credit or any number of credits is also allowed under the Kyoto Protocol to sell that credit to an organization, an institution, an entity that seeks to increase its carbon dioxide emissions, but does not have the allowance. And therefore, if we go back to company X, which wishes to increase its emissions by Y, in order for them to get that permission, that authority to increase their emissions, they could go to company A, which has carbon credits, and buys the amount of credits that they want to increase their emissions by. So very simplistically, this is how emissions trading operates. And now, so these are the mechanisms that were formalized under the Kyoto Protocol. And a compliance and accounting regime was put in place, which would be monitored by the subsidiary bodies, but also by the operation of the Secretariat to the UNFCCC and to the protocol. Next slide, please. Tina already talked about LULUCF, land use change, and forestry. This is particularly important for us here in Africa because, as you know, the bulk of our emissions for the continent actually come from the agriculture sector. The agriculture sector is, in fact, the most important sector for most of our economies. It contributes, up to 30% of GDP in most countries and employs more than 70% of the labor force. And so it is very significant that we take cognizance of emissions from the land use change, and forestry sector, which becomes a follow agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So the Marrakesh COP7 adopted a decision which was aimed at establishing principles to govern emissions from the LULUCF sector. This decision was based on an article of the Kyoto Protocol, which seeks to ensure that net changes in greenhouse gas emissions from sources and removals by sinks resulting from direct human-induced land use and forestry activities shall be used to meet the commitments of parties. So this decision is basically designed to ensure that carbon trading can in fact occur within the LULUCF sector. So in this regard, the COP through the SABSTA requested the IPCC to produce a report on emissions from land use and land use change and forestry. That report was finally produced in 2000 and recommended, among other things, that yes, indeed, LULUCF activities could actually be implemented in ways that would allow for parties to offset their greenhouse gas emissions, and that this could be done in relatively affordable ways. And this led to the creation of the reducing emissions from forestry, from degradation, from forest deforestation and degradation, REDD+. This actually is a program that has a very long evolution, but the focus of REDD+ was essentially to put in place mechanisms to ensure sustainable management of forests, where forests become ecosystems whose main function is to absorb greenhouse gases. And it does this by, firstly, by maintaining the forest cover, but secondly, ensuring that there are no disturbances such as deforestation or degradation of those forests. And the mechanism under carbon trading was that then whoever, an individual or a company or a government that was managing an intact forest system could actually credit the amount of carbon that was being sequestered or stored within that forest system. And in return, they would be able to sell those credits to an entity that wanted to be permitted to emit. The challenge is that in Africa, the price of carbon throughout the operation of the Kyoto Protocol never exceeded $10 per ton, $10 US. At most, it was $7, but for most of the period, it was calculated at between $3 and $7 per ton of carbon. And this proved to be inadequate for forestry to compete with other land use systems. So for instance, you could get more from cutting down a forest and converting it to agriculture. You could get more from trading in valuable timber species within a forest, or for other competing land uses. And that continues to be one of the main challenges of REDD+, the price of carbon. Significantly also, at the same time, the same ton of carbon in other trading systems, such as the European trading system, could sell for upwards of $80 per ton. So there was a massive differential between the price of carbon stored in Africa and the price of carbon credits traded elsewhere. Next slide, please. So we go from Marrakesh to the COP13 in 2007. That COP basically adopted a Bali roadmap and action plan. Again, the intention of that was towards beginning to agree on a successor treaty to the Kyoto Protocol based on the recognition of the limitations of the Kyoto Protocol. This resulted in the COP in Poland in 2007, which focused particularly on assisting developing countries towards supporting adaptation actions for developing countries, but also ensuring that there was technology transfer in order to support developing countries to embark on clean development trajectories. This was followed by the COP15 in Copenhagen, which produced the Copenhagen Accord, focusing specifically on providing finance to developing countries to implement their climate actions. At Copenhagen, developed countries pledged to provide up to $30 billion in what was known as Fast Start climate finance for the 2 years between 2010 and 2012. Significantly also, Copenhagen is where the commitment to provide up to $100 billion a year by 2020 was made. We should note that and I think we have all heard about, we need to have $100 billion a year in climate finance in order to ensure that we can adapt. We should note that there is no scientific basis for the $100 billion a year. It was not produced by either the SBI or SABSTA or by IPCC. Rather, it was a political commitment that was made in an effort to ensure that there was an outcome at Copenhagen. And now, subsequently, since 2020, there is an effort now to agree on a quantified climate finance goal, a global quantified goal on climate finance. And this is one of the main negotiations going to COP28. The global quantified goal recognizes, firstly, that there is no basis for $100 billion a year. Secondly, that $100 billion a year is grossly inadequate for the actual cost of climate actions, particularly under the NDCs, which I'm going to talk about now. And thirdly, that in fact there is, because it is not a binding commitment, very little contributions have been made towards even that inadequate $100 billion a year. So next slide, please. So following on the Copenhagen COP15, the next COP in Mexico continues those discussions about financing climate actions and particularly assisting developing nations with the climate change. And it established the frameworks for the Green Climate Fund, as well as the operationalization of the technology mechanism to support technology transfers. It also established the adaptation framework. All of these are frameworks for supporting climate actions among developing countries. This was followed by the COP17 in Durban in South Africa in 2011, where countries began now to finalize the commitments made at the Bali COP around agreeing on a climate change agreement which would succeed the Kyoto Protocol. Recall the first commitment period of the protocol was in 2012. This was followed by COP18 in Doha in 2011, where countries agreed to speed up the process of agreeing a post-Kyoto protocol. As noted here, in Durban significantly, the issues under agriculture were recommended by the subsidiary body, SABSTA, and the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, the ADP, also focused on how adaptation on the continent could in fact be based on understanding the agricultural processes in Africa. Next slide, please. So now going through some of the COPs after Durban and some of the main agreements that were reached there. The COP19 also in Poland produced the Warsaw outcome, which included a rule book, an operational set of principles for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, operationalized REDD+. But significantly for us, it also adopted the mechanism for addressing loss and damage. This is called the so-called Warsaw mechanism for loss and damage, WIM. The COP20 in 2014 recognized that progress, although progress had been made, there still needed to be a finalization of a successor treaty to the Kyoto Protocol. And governments agreed to make a new and meaningful push towards that universal agreement by 2015. So this is followed immediately by COP21 in Paris in 2015, where the Paris Agreement, which is the current climate change treaty, was adopted. The Paris Agreement, for the first time, brings all nations into an agreement to implement national climate commitments called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. The NDC, the fundamental difference between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol is that the Kyoto Protocol provided for mitigation actions by Annex 1 countries, provided also for Annex 1 countries to make payments to contribute towards the various climate funds that have been established to assist developing countries to manage their climate actions. The Paris Agreement actually says, well, every country has got equal responsibility, even while recognizing the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. The Paris Agreement gives every country the responsibility to implement both mitigation and adaptation actions, as well as to finance them. Although it continues to understand and recognize that developed parties have greater responsibilities than developing countries. So the Paris Agreement also was very quickly ratified. In fact, by 2016, by COP22, all parties had ratified the Paris Agreement, representing upwards of 80% of all global emissions, because everyone is now involved. For Africa, the NDCs of African countries, in fact, give a very strong role to agriculture and the AFOLU sector, in the sense that African countries make many commitments towards putting in place measures to reduce emissions from the agriculture sector, to increase sequestration of emissions in agriculture, in forestry and related mechanisms, but also to invest in adaptation actions in the AFOLU sector. So AFOLU becomes the most significant sector for African NDCs. Also very significant in the sense that most of the implementation of the activities for the African NDCs would be achieved through the availability of funding from outside, from external sources than from domestic resources. This is significant because about 80% of African NDCs would actually be funded from external sources, from sources such as the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and so on, while the projection is that only about 20% would be funded from national funds. Next slide, please. So then we have COP22 immediately after the Paris COP, which created the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. Also began the process of developing a rule book for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Again, the rule book being the processes, mechanisms, and finance required for the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. This is followed by the COP23 in Bonn. The COP23 was actually supposed to be hosted by Fiji in Bula, but the Fiji government, which was the COP presidency, could not afford the cost of the COP. They accepted hosting, they offered to host the COP, knowing fully well that they would not be able to afford the cost of the COP of such a large meeting. But this was a very strategic decision, which was aimed at demonstrating the impact of climate change in a small island developing state. And so the Fiji presidency launched what was called the Talanoa Dialogue, which was intended to help to set the stage for the upward revision of the NDCs. Because the Fiji government and the IPCC, the SABSTA, SBI recognized that the commitments that countries were making under the NDCs, the Paris Agreement commitments, would not be adequate to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 2 degrees, or if possible, reduce that to 1.5 degrees. And that the danger of that would be felt, or was being felt already, in small island developing states like Fiji. And so they launched the Talanoa dialogue to actually begin to think about how NDCs could be revised upwards so that we could get back on track to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The COP23 also established the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, as well as the Coronivia Joint Working Group. The Coronivia was actually a landmark decision which recognized the unique potential of agriculture in tackling climate change. And in particular, the Coronivia decision addressed, next slide, please, 6 interrelated topics related to climate, greenhouse gas releases and sequestration in the agriculture sector. It looked at improving soil carbon, addressing issues around the nutrient use, such as the use of fertilizers, manure management, and so on. It looked at issues around water management, improved livestock management, including livestock emissions, but also rangeland management for grazing. It also developed methods for assessing adaptation, as well as the socio-economic and food security dimensions within the agriculture sector. So that was the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, and this is work that has continued since COP23 and has now become part of the outcomes of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Significantly also, I think, the African Group of Negotiators, and we can talk about how parties are represented in the actual negotiations, but the African Group of Negotiators has an expert group called AGNES, Africa Group of Negotiators Expert Support Group, whose main work has been to monitor the implementation of the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture and to make recommendations about how emissions can be managed in ways that ensure that the agriculture sector continues to develop on the continent. Next slide, please. So then the next couple of COPs really focused on operationalizing the rule book, or rather agreeing on the rule book for the operationalization of the Paris Agreement, starting with the COP24 in Katowice in Poland, followed by COP25, which was in Madrid under the presidency of Chile. Some of the complexities around the adoption of the rule book actually became evident during the Madrid COP, particularly around the operationalization of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which provides for carbon trading, for the creation of carbon markets. This was followed by the COP26 in Glasgow. You will remember that this COP was supposed to be held in 2020, but was postponed to 2021 because of the COVID pandemic. But the main goal of COP26 was to secure commitments to net zero by 2050 in order to ensure that the goal of 1.5 degrees warming would remain within reach. In order to do this, COP26 began the debate around accelerating the phase out of coal, as well as continued the discussions around mobilizing the climate finance pledges that had been made at the Copenhagen COP. Also presented the joint work on agriculture, the Coronivia. Next slide, please. So the last COP that was held was the COP27 in Egypt in 2022. The highlight of this COP was, in fact, the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund. Remember, in the Warsaw COP, there was an agreement to establish a loss and damage fund, but it was never operationalized. It remained the Warsaw mechanism. This was finally resolved in COP27, where the decision was taken to establish a loss and damage fund, and it is in the process of being established. However, the actual design and operationalization of the fund is still to be resolved. Another key outcome was the launch of the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation Initiative, which seeks to improve the quantity and quality of climate finance contributions towards the transformation of African agriculture and food systems by 2030. COP27 was unable to reach agreement on net zero, on the rate at which economies would begin their transition towards net zero, and particularly on the issue of phasing out of coal and other fossil fuels. The Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture was also extended at COP27. The mandate was extended, and the implementation of that joint work on food security was established at COP27. Next slide, please. So what was that Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation? It was a multi-stakeholder, or it is a multi-stakeholder cooperation program where members hold annual meetings to agree on a work program, and is facilitated by the Food and Agriculture Organization. Initially, the program first focuses on access to finance, which seeks to enhance country capacities to identify and access climate finance and investment. Secondly, it has a knowledge and capacity pillar, which focuses on providing the necessary analysis and developing guidelines to support capacity development. And the final pillar is focusing on policy support as well as dialogue between parties. Next slide, please. So beyond the outcomes of COP27, now in 2023, we are heading towards COP28. If you look on the left, you have main decisions that were reached at COP27. You have the decision on loss and damage. You had agreements on clean energy transition. There was an agreement to implement the global stocktake, which is a review of the aggregated impact of the implementation of all NDCs of all parties. We also have agreements on the progress towards the global goal on adaptation. And new agreements that were reached on climate finance, particularly creating opportunities for private sector, bilateral and multilateral initiatives to finance climate actions. So those were the main decisions. On the right column, you have outstanding issues towards COP28. The first is regarding the loss and damage facility. COP28 is going to have to address how that facility is going to be operationalized, how it will be funded, how loss and damage is going to be assessed, who will pay, what the quantum of damages is going to be, and so on. Although COP27 agreed on a clean energy transition, there was no agreement on phasing out coal. The intention towards net zero is to ensure that, in fact, coal be phased out within a certain time period, as recommended by the IPCC. However, many developed country parties still depend on coal. And as we have seen, particularly since the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine, there has been an increase in coal, particularly for power generation among developed countries, parties, as a result of the different interferences with the supply chains for cleaner fuels, including, for instance, for natural gas. So there's an increasing dependency on coal, and this makes it difficult to have an agreement on when coal is actually going to be phased out. There also needs to be agreement on parameters and metrics for measuring many different things, including, for instance, measuring climate finance, what constitutes climate finance, how much is contributed to climate finance, how do we understand the progress towards the goal on adaptation, and so on. The challenge is adaptation takes many different forms in different countries and different contexts, and therefore, can there be a global goal which measures adaptation in the same way in a developed countries versus a developing countries? So COP28 will have to deal with those issues of how do we measure all of these things. Similarly, on climate finance, what are the methodologies and how do we account for climate finance? What is adequate finance? How much finance can be sourced from public versus a private finance? And an emerging debate is really about to what extent do bilateral and multilateral initiatives which are being reached outside of the framework of the finance mechanisms that have been put in place by the Paris Agreement, to what extent do those initiatives actually detract from the provision of public resources to support climate actions? So those are the issues, some of the key issues that are going to be debated at COP28. I think that is my last slide. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, James. It was a heavy package of information. And it was very clear because it took us from the beginning to the end, and it showed rather well how, first of all, there was an agreement, but nothing concise, how you achieved that in Kyoto Protocol, but it was not sufficient, and it was focusing only on developed countries. While in Paris, we have all the countries committing to the climate change, but there's still plenty of issues, especially relating to how do we measure funding, how do we measure results, and how do we finance this?